Hi everyone, did King Arthur really die at the Battle of Camlan? So the Battle of Camlan, according to the Arthurian legend, was Arthur's final battle. It was the culmination, the climax of the civil war that was started by Mordred's rebellion. Mordred was the nephew of King Arthur. He'd been entrusted with the kingdom while Arthur was away, but then he decided to usurp the throne for himself, make himself king, and reject Arthur. So that started a civil war, which culminated in the Battle of Camlan. And this is commonly viewed as the death of Arthur. That's the normal interpretation. Arthur and Mordred both died at the Battle of Camlan. But is this really the case? Is this really what the evidence shows? Or did Arthur actually survive the Battle of Camlan? Let's go back to the earliest evidence. Okay, so the earliest record of the Battle of Camlan is from the Annals Cambriae, which is a 10th century Latin chronicle that refers to various events in just brief little entries, various events over the course of the early medieval period. And according to this, Arthur and Mordred fell at the Battle of Camlan. So this, naturally, is usually taken to mean that they died. And for sure, that is definitely a perfectly valid idea. The reference to them falling could indeed be a reference to them dying. That's absolutely fine. There's nothing strained about that interpretation. But is that the only possible interpretation? Well, it's interesting that throughout the Annals Cambriae, we see the Latin word for died dozens of times. But the word fell in Latin is used very, very rarely. In fact, apart from this entry about Arthur and Mordred, it's used just 3 times to refer to people. And in the case of 2 of those 3 instances, there is evidence from other sources that those figures died. But in the 3rd of those 3 instances, it's ambiguous. There's no definitive evidence from other records that the figure mentioned actually died. So there's no conclusive evidence that this word fell consistently meant died. It's interesting that it's used so rarely in comparison to the word that just means straightforward died. This suggests to me that there's something a bit unusual about this word. It doesn't specifically refer to death, I think. To me, what makes more sense is that this is describing a fall from power, which is often, but not always, accompanied by death. And also, it's used only in the context of battles. In all 4 instances where this word appears in the Annals Cambriae, it's always used in reference to someone falling in battle. So yes, it's usually accompanied by death, but it doesn't necessarily need to be. Now, if Mordred died and Arthur was severely weakened, then it makes sense to use the word fell to sum up both of their fates, rather than using a different word for each of them. The entries in this chronicle are very brief. The chronicler didn't want to write extensively about what happened, so it makes sense to be conservative with one's use of words. So if the word fell could sum up what happened to both of them, with one of them dying, one of them being weakened, well, I think that makes a lot of sense. In any case, the point is, it doesn't require the interpretation that Arthur died at the Battle of Camlan. So, is there any other evidence that helps us to establish what happened? Well, the next earliest record that explains exactly what happened at the Battle of Camlan is Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae. Geoffrey of Monmouth tells us that Arthur was mortally wounded, but then he was taken to the island of Avalon to be healed of his wounds. Now it's true, Geoffrey does specifically use the word mortally wounded, but there's magic in the world of Geoffrey's account. So he specifically says that Arthur was taken to Avalon to be healed of his wounds. And then in the Life of Merlin, which was also written by Geoffrey of Monmouth a few years later, Geoffrey clarifies there that Arthur was able to be healed of his wounds. So despite the fact that it was a mortal injury, he could be healed because there's magic. There's magic throughout Welsh tradition. There's magic in the Historia Regum Britanniae. So this isn't unusual. So the fact that Geoffrey describes it as a mortal wound doesn't mean that Arthur actually died. And the rest of his account makes it clear that Arthur survived. And after mentioning that he was going to be taken to the island of Avalon, it also says that Arthur entrusted the kingship to Constantine. So that again suggests that Arthur didn't die in the battle. If he had died in battle, he wouldn't have been able to then go on to appoint someone else as the next king. Yet Geoffrey makes it clear that that's what Arthur did. So in Geoffrey's account, in both the Historia Regum Britanniae and the Life of Merlin, it makes it clear that Arthur didn't die at the Battle of Camlan. That's what Geoffrey says, and that's the earliest account which specifies exactly what happened. Now, what about Welsh tradition, though? Because Geoffrey's account isn't the final word on the matter, and sometimes Welsh versions of Geoffrey's account change certain details, which indicate, well, since the legends come from the Welsh in the first place, it makes sense to place more weight on those sources where they disagree with Geoffrey's. So what does Welsh tradition say about Arthur and the Battle of Camlan? Well, there's a really interesting video actually that came out a few months ago which talks about this exact topic. And the author of the video there, he explains that there's a triad from the Welsh triads, which is a collection of triads, so collections of threes, about various different things, mainly to do with the Arthurian era, but not exclusively. And one of these triads mentions Mordred as a traitor to the Britons, and it explains that his rebellion caused the Battle of Camlan, and eventually it explains that Arthur died at that battle. So that is an explicit reference to Arthur dying at the Battle of Camlan. So that definitely, unambiguously, supports the view that Arthur died at the battle. But again, that's not the final word either. After all, it does post-date Geoffrey's account, and this particular triad displays clear evidence of influence from Geoffrey's account. So it's not the case that it post-dates Geoffrey's account, but it's actually just a written down version of an oral tradition that predated his account. This triad displays clear evidence of profound influence from the Historia Regum Britanniae, so it definitely is a post-Geoffrey tradition. So we can't be sure whether or not the reference to Arthur dying at the Battle of Camlan is a legitimate pre-Geoffrey tradition or not. However, there's another triad which displays no evidence whatsoever of influence from Geoffrey's account, which is the three violent ravagings of the island of Britain. And in this, it refers to three ravagings of royal courts, which appear to be in chronological order. And the first is when Mordred ravaged Arthur's court in Kellywig, which was in the south. There's debate about whether it was in Cornwall or southeast Wales. I take the latter view, but in any case it was in the south of the island. Now what's really interesting is that it directly associates that with the start of Mordred's rebellion. But then the second violent ravaging of the island of Britain is when Arthur is said to have ravaged Mordred's court. Now why is that so interesting? Well, the reason, and this is really important I think, is that Mordred was from the north. He was a northern prince. He was the son of Lot of Lothian, which was in southeast Scotland. So he was from the north. Everything associates him with the north. He was a northern prince. So his royal court logically would have been in the north. And yet this triad says that after Mordred had ravaged Arthur's court in the south, which was the start of his rebellion against Arthur, Arthur ravaged Mordred's court. So evidently then Arthur must have travelled to the north, to Mordred's territory, to have then ravaged his court. But the problem with this is that there's good evidence that Camlan, the place, should be placed in northwest Wales. There's good evidence that that was the location that the traditions about Arthur was describing. That's the Camlan of Welsh tradition. So let's think about that. Arthur was from the south. He was based in the south of Britain. And according to the tradition, Arthur was away from Britain when Mordred rebelled. All tradition agrees on this. In the Welsh tradition that we saw in the Triads of Britain, where it describes Mordred's rebellion, it says the same thing. There's no evidence whatsoever of any disagreement among the Welsh about this. Arthur was away when Mordred rebelled. He was in Brittany, which is to the south of Britain. And Mordred's rebellion started in the south, at Killywig. Arthur then returned, obviously, from the south. So are we really to believe that Arthur travelled from the south, from Brittany, all the way to the north of Britain and ravaged Mordred's court, then travelled back down south, where Mordred was, and then met him at Camlan? Well, that doesn't make any sense. All the tradition shows that Mordred was fleeing from Arthur. Arthur arrived on the shores of Britain, he fought with Mordred, he defeated him in that first battle, Mordred fled, Arthur pursued him, and then Mordred made his final stand at Camlan, and then that's where the final battle occurred. There's good evidence as well that this initial battle on the shore should be identified with the Battle of Llangborth, where King Geraint of Cornwall died. You can see my other video that talks a bit about that subject. So the fact that Arthur is said in this triad to have ravaged Mordred's court is very difficult to reconcile with the idea that Arthur died at the Battle of Camlan. It makes far more sense with the idea that he didn't die at the Battle of Camlan, and then after defeating Mordred at Camlan in northwest Wales, he continued north to Mordred's territory and ravaged Mordred's court, and probably punished the supporters of Mordred there. That, to me, makes far more sense in view of this triad about the 3 violent ravagings of the island of Britain. It's very difficult, to me, I think, very difficult to reconcile with the idea that Arthur died at Camlan. But there's other evidence from Welsh tradition that Arthur didn't die at Camlan. In fact, this evidence significantly predates Geoffrey of Monmouth. So in this poem here, which dates probably to about 900, although possibly even earlier than that, there's one scholar who dates it to about 750, but in any case, it's definitely a pre-Geoffrey tradition. So in this tale, Arthur is said to have gone to this place called Annwn, which is this place somewhere far away which Arthur has to sail to. It's kind of mythical, this mythical location that Arthur has to sail to with Taliesin. Now that's interesting because in Geoffrey of Monmouth's account, the only sea voyage that bears any resemblance whatsoever is when Arthur is taken by Merlin and Taliesin to Avalon. And the connection between Annwn and Avalon is very, very clear in the records. For example, in Welsh records, Avalon is called Avalach, and this is the name of the king of Annwn. And also in this poem, there's a reference to 9 maidens on the island of Annwn, which is interesting because in Geoffrey of Monmouth's account, in the life of Merlin, he mentions 9 magical sisters who ruled Avalon. So there's a lot of evidence that Annwn and Avalon were the same place. Annwn was the Avalon of Welsh tradition. They are the same place. So this poem about Arthur's journey with Taliesin to Annwn, logically, is the Welsh antecedent for Geoffrey of Monmouth's account of Arthur's journey with Taliesin to Avalon. And of course, in Geoffrey of Monmouth's account, that takes place after Camlan, whereas in this Welsh poem, Arthur is clearly shown to still be alive and a king. If we were to try to say that this refers to an earlier voyage, then that would mean that we would have to say that Arthur went on an earlier voyage to Avalon, and there's no trace of that in Geoffrey of Monmouth's account, no trace of that in Welsh tradition. So to me, what makes far more sense is the idea that Geoffrey's account of Arthur sailing to Avalon is his version of this Welsh tale about Arthur sailing to Annwn with Taliesin, who appears in both accounts. And it's just that Geoffrey has misinterpreted it as being Arthur mortally wounded. It's interesting that in this poem it mentions a great disaster. It doesn't explain what exactly happened, but it's clear that this voyage to Annwn ended in tragedy. It's entirely possible that is actually when Arthur died. The poem doesn't explicitly say that, but it could easily be understood that way. There's a clear vibe of tragedy and loss. So that could well be when Arthur died, and Geoffrey simply misinterpreted things to make Arthur mortally wounded when he was taken to Avalon. In view of the Annals Cambriae, I would say that Arthur was severely weakened, maybe not physically wounded, but his power was damaged significantly because of this civil war that Mordred had instigated. and then he went on this journey to Avalon, wherever that was, and then he died there. And so that, I believe, is the origin of Geoffrey's account of the voyage to Avalon, with Arthur mortally wounded and sailing there to be healed of his wounds. It's interesting that in this poem about the voyage to Camlan, there's reference to a magical cauldron, and another magical cauldron appears elsewhere in Welsh tradition with the power to revive the dead. So maybe those two things are related. There's also evidence from Latin records that Arthur survived the Battle of Camlan. So in the life of St. Gildas, Gildas is said to have gone to Ireland to preach, and he's said to have gone to Ireland in the reign of a king who we know ruled between 566 to 569. So Gildas went there, he preached for a while, he established churches and converted many people, and then, while he was there, Arthur killed Gildas's brother, Hyle. And then after that, Gildas returned to Britain, and he had a reconciliation with Arthur. So Arthur is presented very explicitly as being alive after Gildas had spent time preaching in Ireland, which he went to in the late 560s. Whereas the Battle of Camlan occurred when? Well, if you take the early chronology, which says that the Battle of Camlan occurred in about 537, then he definitely must have survived that. If you take the later chronology, which is my viewpoint, which is that the Battle of Camlan occurred in 570, then this still supports the idea that Arthur survived the Battle of Camlan. Because remember, Arthur was away from Britain for a while before Mordred rebelled, and then that led directly to the Battle of Camlan. So if the Battle of Camlan occurred in 570, Arthur was away from Britain before then, in the few years before then, so the late 560s. While Gildas went to Ireland in the late 560s, stayed there for a while preaching, Arthur had his conflict with Hyle, Gildas returned, and Arthur was still alive. So this, again, very clearly supports the viewpoint that Arthur was still alive in the years after the Battle of Camlan, which was in 570 according to the late chronology, or earlier according to other chronologies. So this account in the life of St. Gildas is not compatible with the idea that Arthur died at the Battle of Camlan. And then, of course, you've got the tradition from Scotland, which is that Arthur pursued and killed his wife who had rebelled with Mordred after the Battle of Camlan. The tradition that he let his dogs loose on her and they tore her to pieces. This tradition is related to the Vanora stone, which, according to tradition, it marks the grave of Guinevere, and it was named after her. Vanora, it's an alternative form of Guinevere, and this, well, it shows what's actually a depiction of Daniel in the lion's den, but it was misinterpreted as a depiction of Arthur's wife Guinevere being torn to pieces by dogs. So that's unhistorical, but the point is, the tradition says that this was Arthur punishing his wife, who had rebelled with Mordred, after the Battle of Camlan. So after he defeats Mordred, he then goes and continues pursuing Guinevere up north and kills her. Now, while that may be completely unhistorical, the point is, the fact that there's a tradition that says this shows that there's a tradition that Arthur didn't die at the Battle of Camlan. Otherwise, the whole premise for this tradition about Guinevere being killed by Arthur after the rebellion of Mordred was put down completely falls to pieces. In another version, it's Arthur's men who punish her, which logically would be what would happen, or what would have happened if Arthur had died. Yet the fact that there's at least one version which says that Arthur was the one who killed her shows that there was this trace of this tradition that Arthur didn't die at the Battle of Camlan. Now, interestingly, going back to the issue of Hyle, the timing fits very, very well with the Battle of Camlan. My view actually is that Arthur's conflict with Gildas's brother is actually the same as his conflict with Mordred, and that Gildas's brother Hyle was involved in the rebellion against Arthur. So when the record in the life of St. Gildas talks about Arthur pursuing Hyle up north and then killing him there, that's part of the route that he took, pursuing Mordred. So he pursued from the south, from South Wales, he pursued Mordred and his army and his allies, defeated many of them at the Battle of Camlan, continued north, where he eventually killed Hyle, Gildas's brother, and it was around that time where he ravaged Mordred's royal court, as per the Welsh triads. And then after that, he went on his journey to Annan. To me, that scenario is far more consistent with the weight of evidence, with the earliest evidence, with the evidence from Welsh tradition, whereas in comparison, the idea that Arthur died at the Battle of Camlan is based on an ambiguous reference in the Annals Cambriae and one source in Welsh tradition. Whereas I would say all this other evidence clearly supports Arthur surviving the Battle of Camlan for at least a few years. But if you have another perspective, feel free to put that in the comments below. Now here's another question for you. Was the Ithaca of Greek mythology, the home of Odysseus, the same as the Ithaca of modern day? Or was it actually a different island that's been misinterpreted as the modern day Ithaca? Well, if you'd like to learn the answer, come back next time for my next video.